Thanks. That was a fascinating lecture. Thank you so much for sharing your new stuff with us as well. We feel very privileged for that. I've got lots of questions. I don't know whether I want to take Chair's advantage and ask that first. No, I won't. I'll offer it first of all to the audience and ask, has anybody in the audience got any questions which they'd like to ask? Okay, we've got one near the back.
If you can take them in threes, that will be best.
Okay, are there any other questions at the moment? Yeah, one at the front just to keep you on your feet.
Hi there.
We'll start off with two and then we'll see how we get on.
Hi, I'm Max Morris, a postgraduate here at Durham. Thank you, I really enjoyed the talk and sort of principally agree with the vast majority of what you've said, and I thought there was some really good stuff in there, particularly the stuff about enthusiastic consent and agency and all of that kind of stuff. Kind of two quick questions for you. Firstly, a kind of methodological question. Lots of the evidence you drew on in this presentation tended to be kind of quite sensationalist, tabloid-type newspaper headlines and, you know, a selection of images and tweets and things like that. I'm just wondering, how strongly can you build a picture of a very pessimistic society, which is, as you describe it, a kind of a commodifying sexual culture? I just wonder, what's the strength of your argument in terms of evidence for that? Maybe you have more than you presented here today. Secondly, I'm just a little bit concerned. As I said, I principally agree with the idea of enthusiastic consent very strongly, but I'm a little bit worried that the way in your sort of prescriptions for it are a little bit simplistic. So, for example, often I have a lot of sex, and often I lie there very passively, and it's awesome. So I'm just wondering, kind of, for those of us who engage in sexual practices that maybe are intentionally commodified, those of us who engage in commercial sex, those of us who are interested in BDSM sex, those kinds of alternative forms of sexuality don't seem to fit quite so neatly with the kind of paradigm shift that you're describing. And I just wonder, kind of, how does your model fit with people who engage in those practices with total agency and enjoy it fully?
Sure. Thanks. We'll take one at the front and then we'll answer those because there's quite a lot there already.
Who had a question? I think he said he wanted us to take a bunch of.
Hi, thanks for that. I really enjoyed it. Loved the collaborative model you talked about. Great way of describing it. I suppose my question, particularly when you went to the hooking up culture stuff.
I'm sorry?
Potentially the bit where you went to the hooking up culture stuff. To some extent, I was thinking the other critique you can make in terms of your model is of monogamy. We know that it's in monogamy where people aren't being enthusiastic about consent, at least after 5 years or so. And we know that that there's issues with monogamy as an institution as well, and how you would incorporate that as a critique, or whether you would reject it.
Okay, I'm going to start there because I think my answer to yours is shorter. I think that we should have agency in terms of relational models as well. So I don't think that we want to throw the baby out with the bathwater. I personally prefer monogamy and have tried multiple relational models and find that monogamy works best for me. I do think that monogamy as an overwhelming institution needs to be challenged, right? Because it is so dominant that it removes a lot of people's agency to choose otherwise. So that's what I would say about is there another question there? It was primarily about monogamy. Okay, I thought there's a lot in here. So that's sort of where I fall on that. I don't ever want to demonize monogamy. I think it's a good option for some people, but just like any other set of options, I ultimately believe that there aren't any inherently empowering or degrading decisions you can make about how you run your sex life. It's about whether or not you have agency when you make the decision, right? And so I don't think monogamy is better or worse than polyamory or whatever other systems might be there. And to the extent that the dominant culture proposes that it is, that I'm opposed to. Okay, 2 questions. The second one, I'm going backwards because you're gonna have to remember what the very first question was. But in terms of BDSM, in terms of lying passively, I'm very pro-kink. You can absolutely practice enthusiastic consent. You just have to check in with your partner. Sometimes that's negotiated ahead of time, right? And so you may say, I like to have sex in this way. I want you to know that that's how I express enthusiasm. That's you consenting. I do believe that when you're playing with those things, when you're playing at things that look non-consensual, might from the outside, that it's important to have a safe word, right? So that if you, in fact, do change your mind and are lying there passively and it no longer means the same thing, you have a way to indicate that. But I don't think that that violates any of this. It's a question of, are you enthusiastically consenting to play that role, right? That's what you're being enthusiastic about. And don't misunderstand the word enthusiasm. I think sometimes it gets heard too loudly. You can be this is not about having peak sexual experience at all times, right? If you can pull that off, please tell me how. This is about being into it in a general way. So you can also be enthusiastic about trying something, right? You can say, I don't know if I will like that, or having sex with this person or whatever, but I'm enthusiastic about finding out, right? I would like to know. You can be enthusiastic about pleasing your partner, right? This doesn't do anything for me one way or the other. I'm not opposed to it, but I really like turning you on. I like pleasing you. I'm enthusiastic about that. So don't be so, it's not so narrow as it looks. They're very overarching ideas. Enthusiasm can come in a lot of different forms. What was the first question?
It was about evidence.
Oh, what is the evidence? I will say that I am an activist and not an academic. That's the first thing I will say. So I read a lot of studies. I was a psychology major. I know how to read research. But I'm not largely an academic. My evidence comes from many thousands of people that I talk to, right? I will say that there's very strong evidence of the results of the culture, right? So for example, young women all across America think rape is normal, right? That's my evidence. Could you say that the media influence is correlation as causation? We could have that argument. But I feel pretty confident in that. I don't know, there may be people in the room who actually know the research better than I do. Do you?
Yeah, I don't think anything that I heard, I don't think very much that I heard is contradicted by the research evidence. I mean, certainly there's research that's come out this year by Liz Kelly and others around consent and around how understanding consent works. And, all of the research evidence shows that people are very, very poor at this, which is kind of what you're saying, yes. Isn't it? That how are we supposed to learn this and just suddenly, click our fingers at the age of 16, 18, whatever age that society prescribes and says that we know how to negotiate sexual consent. So I think the majority of what you said actually is backed up by the research evidence that I'm aware of.
The other thing I'll say is that there's really interesting research into a concept called stereotype threat, which some of you probably are familiar with, which very clearly demonstrates that when people are cued, they're reminded of negative stereotypes about a group that they belong to, they behave according to those stereotypes, right? So if a woman even takes an SAT test next to two men instead of next to two women, she will do more poorly on the SAT test next to two men, because she's, even just the presence of those two men as opposed to the two women being in the minority, gender minority, reminds her that women are not supposed to be as smart or as good at tests. It works, on race, there's a lot of research on this. And I think that when you look at the media stuff, it's constantly cueing those stereotypes. And so, again, I can't cite you a study that links cueing of those stereotypes all the way to all of the conclusions I made, but there's an enormous amount of research that supports it at a lot of different points.
I suppose it's also interesting how theories as well are backed up and reflected in kind of real life experiences as well of talking to women and women's experiences. So I'm thinking about when you were talking about how a lot of women who do victim blaming do it as a self-protection mechanism for themselves. That's based on a theory about belief in the just world, that if you act well, others will be just towards yourself. And obviously we know that's not true, but it serves a function in believing that. Mm-hmm. Okay, I've got 3 questions. Perfect. I'll go 1, 2, 3. Nice small area for you, Patrick.
So first off, thank you so much for that talk. It was absolutely fantastic and a lot to think about. And I'd like to ask a question. I'll try and avoid the academic temptation to give this a long preamble. I'll try to get to it. That connects to the last 2 questions, and I think to a theme that was lurking in the talk you gave that I'd quite like to bring out. You've presented you've taken aim at a sort of heteronormative ideal, but you've been very clear that your approach applies to all sorts of different sexual groups, poly, you said, and non-monogamy, and kink, and queer, and all sorts of things. With that in mind, and with the individual differences in tastes and preferences and agency that you've mentioned, how do we know, as individuals and as a society, what sex is?
Ooh. I love that you asked that question.
Hi, firstly that was a really fantastic talk and one I wish I'd heard so much earlier in my life. But I just wanted to ask, and this might put the cat among the pigeons a little bit, what your view on sex work is, and do you think this can ever be like a career, just a career people choose, or do the structural imbalances in our society mean it can't really be consensual?
Amazing.
Hi. What everyone else said about you being awesome, basically, you're awesome.
Oh, thank you.
Sorry, yeah, Scouse accent.
There's a lot of echo up here. I'm having a little trouble with it.
One of the things you mentioned in your talk, you were talking about people, you know, when they were getting sentenced to rape, the sentence was like pathetic. It was like, you know, they were getting suspended for 1 semester and allowed back. The thing is, for me, the barrier to reporting was I did not want to send my boyfriend to jail. Can you envision justice for victims that doesn't necessarily involve putting people in the slammer?
Oh, absolutely. Yeah. Oh, these are amazing questions. We are getting into it. Okay. What is sex? What about sex work? And what about the criminal justice system? You got to the chase, people. And I heard the Brits sort of beat around the bush a little. What is sex? That's a fantastic question to which I don't know the answer. I would tend to say that it involves, we could go biological, and I happen to know that you have a biological background, so it probably involves the release of certain hormones and all of that, but that's not where I'm coming from with it. You know, it involves the stimulation of your tingly bits, whether directly or indirectly. But I think that, I think ultimately it's subjective, right? Sex itself is a construct, which is, I suspect, why you asked that question. And it really is in some ways up to the agreement of the people having it, right? Whether that they are having sex. You know, if I might use a more benign metaphor, as you can tell I like to do, you know, oftentimes two people are on a date, or maybe one of them is on a date and the other one is not on a date, right? So just like virginity is ultimately a meaningless concept, right? And we can talk about that more if people want me to dive into that, because it seems like you want me to open all the cans of worms, so I'm in. You know, sex ultimately is sort of in the eye of both or more beholders, right? You know, is oral sex sex? Is anal sex sex? What if I touch you here? Or, you know, like any sort of line you draw is going to ultimately leave out somebody's experience. So I think that is also a question that one must have agency to answer. I hope you don't think that's a dodge. Okay. You know, I have to define these things for research purposes and those sorts of things. So, you know, every study that is sex has a definition, but I don't think that's a moral or an inherent definition. Sex work. Do I think that it's possible to just choose it as a career? Nelly. First of all, in case that's not perfectly clear from my lecture, I think that it's possible to do sex work with lots of different levels of agency, right? So there are some people who are genuinely trafficked into it, in which case they are slaves, right? That just the way that people are trafficked into any form of labor are slaves. At the same time, you know, as I'm saying that, we have to acknowledge that a lot of enslavement, not all enslavement involves rape, right? Like, you know, certainly if you were being tracked into sex work, that's rape, like, period. Like an enormous range of experience where people aren't trafficked, but choose sex work not because they think, you know what I'd like to be when I grow up? I would like to be a sex worker. But because a lot of women, although this is, you know, it's not, I don't have a number for you, but many women who enter sex work, and I'm more familiar with women in sex work than I am in people of other genders. So again, I know there are people who are very smart on many subjects in this room, and so if you want to add anything, instead of asking a question, please speak up. A lot of women choose it because, well, A, there's wage discrimination against women, and so it's harder for women to make money, and B, there's also class discrimination, and it's harder for some people to make money regardless of their gender, and sex work can be quite lucrative, right? So is that agency? You know, that gets into this sort of question of power, right? Like, how much power do you have in relation to the decision that you're making, as well as in relation to the person you're having sex with? And I think I don't think there's like again, I don't think there's a bright line here. I think it's theoretically possible, yes, to engage in sex work because that is your chosen career. Also, I would say, on the other side, like, lots of people go into other careers because they can make more money at it, right? Like, so do bankers, right? Like, most people don't grow up wanting to be a banker because they love banking. Some people do, but probably most bankers chose it because they thought it'd be lucrative, right? So, I think that when we oversimplify the conversation about sex work and we separate it from any conversation about labor decisions in general, we're kind of missing the boat. It is in some ways a special kind of labor, but there are other kinds of special labor categories. And ultimately, I think that we want to think about the conditions of the work, right? Is the worker free to choose the work, right? And economic freedom is one of those questions, but it's not a yes or no answer. It's a whole continuum. But, you know, can the person do the job and be free from violence, right? You know, can the person do the job and be free from arrest and harassment? You know, all of these things. I think that the question that most concerns me about sex work is how can we improve the conditions of the labor, including ending trafficking. Obviously, that is terrible labor conditions. So that's where I am. It's mushy. It's an interesting conversation. It's an important question. But I think the number one thing that I would say about sex work is that we have to listen to sex workers, right? The people who most know what needs to be done in the here and now to make the situation around sex work better are sex workers, and we need to make sure that they're centered in any conversation about it. And I have never engaged in sex work, so you can take my entire opinion with a grain of salt. I'm answering it because I'm up here in the chair, and I do think about these things. And then the last question was...
Alternatives to the criminal justice system?
Alternatives to the criminal justice system, yes. So when I say reporting, and I should maybe clarify, because in the US, most campuses have an on-campus judicial system that's separate from the criminal justice system, which is about can the person can the victim get the perpetrator to not live in their housing, or maybe they're going to get kicked off campus. It's not about locking them up in any way. It's about them losing the privilege to be on campus. And so I should probably clarify that, because I understand that the situation is not the same here. And we can debate the various merits or demerits of the various systems, but that headline was about whether Brown as an institution was holding rapists on its campus accountable, not whether it was locking them up. I think the criminal justice system is a terrible response to sexual violence. I think it is a location of a lot of sexual violence. I think there's no evidence that it rehabilitates offenders. I think there is precious little research into what will rehabilitate offenders. And if I were focusing on offenders, which is not the center of my work, that's what I would be giving you a lecture about, why we need to be spending a lot more research into figuring out how to rehabilitate offenders, right? Instead of just locking them up. I know that there are alternatives to criminal justice, restorative and transformative justice processes, which, how many of you are familiar with that terminology? I'm curious. Okay, a smattering. These are more community-based processes in which the victim and the community find ways outside the criminal justice to hold the perpetrator to account. I'm not intimately familiar with these, I'll say that up front, and again, some of you may be more familiar with them. I think they hold promise, but I think the danger of adjudicating sexual violence in a restorative justice process is that the rapists know what to say. Right? That they know how to make it sound like they get what the problem is now and they're sorry, right? These repeat perpetrators especially, and when I said there was a myth of misunderstanding earlier, I'm not saying that there's never been a misunderstanding that's resulted in a sexual assault. I'm just saying that the predominant cases that we see, most of them are these repeat perpetrators who know what they're doing and are doing it under a cloak of misunderstanding. And these repeat perpetrators, they know what they're doing and they know how to sound penitent, right? And so I think that my worry, and I don't have any evidence this is happening or not happening, I don't know that there are enough restorative justice processes happening to even study this, but my worry is that they'll be able to make the right sounds and then continue to offend. So I think that's the challenge for restorative justice processes to address. I still think that's better than locking somebody up. I don't think that addresses much of anything.
I am going to take chair's action now and ask my questions because they fit quite nicely into this. And this really is from studying offenders.
Yeah.
I'm thinking particularly about a study which we've been doing for some time now about domestic violence perpetrator rehabilitation programs. Certainly not all, but there are always a proportion of men who can do what they need to do and what they need to say to pass a program. And I'm wondering what we do about the men who are in long-term intimate partner relationships who've been domestically violent for battering in American language for 20, 30 years and who are using sexual violence as a form of power and control and as a form of entrapment to women, and how much they would actually be invested in even the new framework, which I think, as you say, it sounds perfectly reasonable for the hookup. I'm a long time out of hookup situations, but they sound like they would fit, that your framework fits more with that than the kind of longer term violent partners.
Well, I think that what I didn't say, I was trying to shove a lot in there, but to be clear, the reason that enthusiastic consent as a model, that the creative collaborative model, will make communities safer is not because it's going to educate these repeat offenders out of offending, right? It might educate the people who might have misunderstandings around the edges, right? But it's not going to do anything for the repeat offenders who know they don't have consent and don't care, right? It's about making that visible to everyone so that we can start to address it, right? So making that behavior not look normal. And so I think the same thing applies. I think there's more cultural consensus that someone who's been beating their intimate partner for 20 years doesn't look normal, right? Although we don't tend to necessarily see the signs very well when we're not inside that relationship. And so, yeah, it's about resetting norms. Now, the question sort of hanging over this, related to the question I just answered, is, you know, if those people cannot be rehabilitated, what then? And I don't have a very satisfying answer. I mean, maybe those people we do want to lock up, but then we have the same question that somebody raised, which is, you know, will fewer people come forward if they know that their partner, you know, a lot of times victims want to protect their partners, whether it's one-time sexual violence or ongoing abuse. That's very common. So I think that again, I think my answer to that is sort of having a multiplicity of options, right? That there need to be a place where somebody can go and say, this is happening to me and I need help, but I don't want to press charges. And a place where we can go to press charges, right? If the victim wants that. The response should always be survivor-centered, right? Because ultimately, any of these crimes that we're discussing here are about lack of control and lack of agency, the violation of agency. And so what you want to do most is restore agency to survivors. I know you know that. And so, so having more control over the process is what we most want, and having those options. There's been a trend lately that I've seen where there's been an argument that's starting to be made that if a victim doesn't report to the police or to the authorities in general, they're responsible, right, for the further rape that the rapist, if they're a victim and it turns out of a repeat perpetrator, which statistics say that chances are high, although not 100%, then they have some moral obligation to report so that that person can be taken out of the population. The first thing I would say is, I don't know what the statistics are in the UK, but in the US, the statistics for actually locking up rapists are abysmal, like 3%. Right? So the odds that actually if you report and someone's going to get locked up, even if you want that to happen, are very, very low. And we know in the US that the reports are are prosecuted less often than other violent crimes. Like if you report to the police, it's less likely to get prosecuted, and if it is prosecuted, it's less likely to result in a conviction than all other violent crimes. Is it similar here? Yes. So, you know, there's that. I think that's sort of like that fear like of locking up. And I understand, again, I can't quite see the person who said that, but when I was assaulted, I brought my perpetrator to our campus judicial process, and he was kicked off campus. He was suspended for a year. You know, now I'm like, well, why on earth would they let him back on campus, right? But then I felt like, oh my God, I've ruined his life, right? And it was very difficult for me to deal with, because we are like, the myth about the boiling frog, you know, that if you put a frog in water and you slowly heat it, it'll never jump out. It actually turns out not to be true, because I included it in my last book and it was fact checked, and they were like, this isn't true. And I was like, well, let's just say it's a myth. But it's a useful metaphor. You know, I think that we're all trained to be either victims or bystanders or whatever role we're playing. We're trained long before the assault begins, right? So I didn't get that message from anybody after I was assaulted. I was already prepared to feel like I was ruining his life. So part of me is like, we already erred too far on that side. But then I come back to sort of survivor-centered. So like, you know, my answer to that ultimately would be, I want options for the victim, right? Maybe there is a point at which locking the person up is the only response. I'll allow that that's possible. I don't know where to draw that line. But I also want that person to have options that don't involve that.
I guess one of the things is that there's remarkably little research on offenders that is framed within a feminist understanding of rape, and that a lot of research on sexual and domestic violence offenders has tended to be more a psychological and psychiatry-based approach to the study. So I think we need to stop being afraid of the caricature of the rapist and the stereotype of the rapist, and do more research as feminists, researchers on the topic.
Oh, I could not agree more. And I don't know about you, but the research that I've seen, and it sounds like this is true for you as well, is about rehabilitating domestic violent offenders who may or may not be using sexual violence, but are also using other forms of violence, right? And there is some research that shows that there are certain models that have, you know, a fairly good effectiveness, right? They're not 100%, but they do prevent some people from reoffending. But I don't see any research, I've not seen any that's strictly about sort of sexual offenders, exclusively. Have you?
I mean, ironically, it's American, the research which I have seen, and I know when I teach it in class, I go back to Diana Scully's study of convicted rapists in America in the early 90s as, to me, the best. It is the ones which are already convicted, but I suppose the fact that we use that as our baseline still goes to show how little has gone ahead of it. Right. Yeah. I'll stop using chair's privilege now and open it back up to the floor. We've got one here and one right at the back, and
behind you,
one in the middle.
Hi, thank you. You talked a lot about commodification of sex and things. I was wondering, it might be wishful thinking, whether you're involved in any sort of collaborative projects, anti-capitalist, feminist collaborative projects or groups.
I'm sorry, I'm only getting a little bit of this. Can you speak a little slower? It's really echoey up here.
Sorry. You talked a lot about commodification, and I was thinking about, I was wondering whether you're involved in any anti-capitalist, feminist, collaborative sort of projects, and how much you think capitalism and the capitalist paradigm is a big part of the problem.
And then there was one at the back.
You mentioned about the issues surrounding how we educate young people about sex and about what's okay, what isn't okay, what they should be expecting. I've worked with young people to improve their sex education in the UK, and they mentioned that a lot of the problems are surrounding the fact that teachers and members of staff aren't really comfortable discussing this with them. How do you think we can go about starting that kind of conversation in a classroom?
And then one at the front.
And the last one.
Hi. Sorry, I'm a little bit nervous. It's gone right out of my head. But we live in a society that's so hostile to people who have survived sexual violence. I was wondering if you mentioned that a lot of the time people don't think that they can possibly know a rapist because everybody knows that rapists are bad. Our friends are not bad people, therefore our friends can't be rapists and abusers. What are some ways that you would suggest you can sort of, especially for people with anxiety who aren't comfortable calling out friends because they're afraid of violence or they're afraid of how they're going to react, to gently, not necessarily to gently challenge that, but to challenge that, to encourage other people to challenge it, and to try and make society a safer place for people who have experienced sexual violence? Did that make sense? I feel like it went round in my head.
So it was a question about capitalism and the role, sex education and culture, change in rape culture, standing up to rape culture.
That's all. Capitalism, sex ed, and standing up to rape culture. Okay, capitalism, yes. Capitalism is so tied up in this, right? You know, we can't talk about a commodity model without talking about capitalism. And capitalism is very invested in us all not having agency, so that we can feel great anxiety about that, and we can be sold things to soothe that anxiety. So I'm not officially involved in anti-capitalist feminist campaigning, but yes, absolutely, and well spotted. I'm not affiliated with an official group or anything. Sex ed in classrooms. How do we start the conversation? I think that you put your finger on one of the keys, which is that the people it would fall to also were raised in this culture, right? They feel like it's not okay to talk about sex. They may also hold many of these same values we're trying to dismantle. And so it really is quite an undertaking. It's a long-term project of mine to actually start researching how we might get to shift the way that we teach sex ed. Because there's an enormous amount of agreement among experts in the field that we need to be teaching comprehensive pleasure-based sex ed. You know, there's disagreement about what that means and at what age we should, you know, there's disagreement around the margins, but there's an enormous amount of agreement and consensus that this is what we should be teaching if we want healthier outcomes. And yet, in the States, when you bring it up, people just say, oh, well, you could never do it, right? We should totally be doing this, you can't do it in the schools. Yeah, the schools are the only place that you can reach everyone, right? You can reach all the young people. So I think that what you have to do, and this would be an enormous undertaking, you'd have to have an enormous amount of political capital organized to get this done. It would be national legislation. You'd have to train the trainers first, right? You'd have to first develop a curriculum so that you'd have qualified teachers to teach it, right? And then you'd have to make space in the curriculum for it, which I don't know if that's an issue over here, but in the US there's a lot of argument about how much of the content, you know, they're dropping art and music and sports because it's all teach to the test. The school day is getting a lot more rigid and not moving in the other direction. So the idea of adding this in is also daunting from a structural perspective, so it has to also do with educational reform writ large. It's quite a project. I don't say it easily. I don't think that it's an easy thing to do. But I do think this. There's a phenomenon, it's a sociological phenomenon, the name of which always escapes me, even though it's great. Someone here will tell me what it is. Where people think that they are in the minority, they hold a belief that's in the minority, and in fact, they are in the majority and everyone else is being quiet because they also think they're in the minority, right? And I think that is true about sex ed. I think the vast majority of people, parents, would love the schools to do a better job of talking to their kids about sex, if for no other reason that parents feel totally helpless and confused about it and don't want to do it, right? They don't feel equipped to do it, and they want someone to do it because they want their kids to be safe. And I think even in more conservative areas, when you do the research, and I've seen this specifically happen in some fairly conservative counties in North Carolina, which is in the southern part of the United States, which it can be a fairly conservative place to be, that they've moved from abstinence only to sort of disaster prevention, but they've had some progressive movement because they started to discover that actually everyone secretly wants this to happen, or most people, and there's a few loud people who want to stop it. And so we need to pierce that, it's the second word in the phrase is ignorance. It's pluralistic ignorance. That's what it is. We have to pierce the pluralistic ignorance around this and create political capital to create a social outcry, so to create leverage to get this done. Because to do it right would require really a lot of funding and structure. I wish I knew an easier way.
Yeah, I mean, we have come remarkably close in this country. We've had 2 votes in Parliament to make it mandatory, but both have unfortunately failed.
How much have they failed by?
I can't remember, actually. It wasn't a complete landslide, but it didn't get passed through.
Well, then keep pushing. You're close.
Do you have some closing comments for us, maybe, Nicole?
Could I take the one question at the back, though, that I've missed first, please? Oh, sorry, 2 questions.
Oh, I forgot your question.
Oh,
I'm very sorry.
Right. Well, yeah. While Patrick's going with that. Okay. Yeah. Sorry. Yes, I was thinking we were talking about sex education also to train people to. It's connected. Yeah. Yeah. At the back.
Yeah. Thank you for the talk. This isn't a question. It's more of a ramble. And you can make sense of it as you want to. It starts with my closing point, and that is, do you think you're trivializing sex a bit? In the sense of, you could take this metaphor, trivializing sex, yeah?
What did she say? Trivializing. Oh, trivializing sex.
So you take this metaphor of, people, do you want to jam with me? Yeah, let's jam. But couldn't you argue that it's actually more than that? And couldn't you argue that, in a sense, you're almost ignoring that there are other aspects? You can be really enthusiastic, but it doesn't necessarily mean that's the best thing to do at the time. And it also brings me back to your point about agency and how it's not just about people being too young, it's about power. So if an older person is taking advantage of a younger person, but wouldn't you say that's a bit of a slippery slope in the sense that there might be 2 younger people who take on this enthusiastic model, they're both enthusiastic, they both had the appropriate conversation, but not actually properly developed to have engaged in something which, as you said, is quite a powerful thing. It then goes back to the question, the slide you had about risks. And I think, again, that was a bit trivialized in the sense that, yeah, there are some risks that we see as risks. But I could walk out, and it's a risk to walk out in the streets and get run over by a car. Or I could run across a side of a river and fall to, plunge to my death. They're 2 very different types of risks and I think risks can be separated. And just because, you say there are risks in all types of decisions, it doesn't mean that, therefore, there are risks that are just there and you just have to deal with it. There's some risks which really should be avoided. I did have one more point. See, as I said, I'm sorry, this is a ramble. Oh, yes, yeah, post-fem. So I have this issue of, feminism, second-wave feminism. And it's something that someone challenged me on, because I was always really for it. I was like, yo, pro-woman, woo. But then I had a female say, don't you think that this idea of sexual liberation amongst females, this idea of kind of trying to say that also females have this, this sexual side, not just men, isn't this, in a way, something that's devised to also be advantageous for men, that we as women can't, if we're really sexually liberated, we can't say we also think our virginity is something that's special, that it's just another random act. Because you can compare sex to anything else. You can say that someone won't be judged for jumping off a bridge in a bungee rope. However, there's something different in sex. The fact that I would have to take off my clothes, you would have to take off your clothes, and we have to engage in something very personal. And that goes back to my first point about trivializing sex. And that if you're just talking about the act, you almost forget everything else that could go with it, even if you are engaging in it enthusiastically.
Okay, so trivializing sex and also the question of risk, and then we're going to come back to you and we're going to close with it, okay? Because I think it's a great place to close. I don't think I'm trivializing sex. I think it sounds like sex is very important and special to you, and that's great, and you should behave that way. But I think different people in this room have different experiences and relationships to sex. And my point is we should all be equally free to pursue the kind of sex and the relationship to sex that works for us. Some people have a very casual relationship to sex. As long as they're not infringing on anybody else's agency, there's nothing wrong with that. So my point is not that we should all have casual sex. my point is that we should all be free to make the choices that work for us. And that's very different than making it trivial. I think it's very important that we're free. There are huge consequences that we are or are not free to make the choices that work for us. It's quite the opposite of trivial. And I agree that different risks are different amounts risky. But in no other area of life do we advise people that the best thing to do is always to minimize risk, right? There are a lot of things where we encourage people to take enormous risks, right? Because risk reduction is not the only thing we value in all other areas of life. And so my point about risk is not that all risks are equal, but that you get to evaluate which risks you want to take and which ones you want to avoid, and that risk reduction is not the only point, right? Because you also have to do a reward evaluation, right? How much worth it to me is it taking this risk? Because what are the great things that could happen? It doesn't negate that there are different levels of risk. It just means that we all have agency to decide which risks are worth it to us. So let's close by talking about what all people in this room can do to make a better world for each other. That is a fantastic question. It is difficult to talk one-on-one with people, but it is actually the most effective thing that you can do as a person, right? So instead of assuming you're not going to do that, I want to talk about how to make that easier. The first thing is don't do it in front of other people, right? So if a friend of yours says something that's super commodity model and offensive, and you're like, hey, that is really upsetting to me, or is victim blaming or something, put a pin in it and wait till later is a thing you could do, right? Ask to talk to them, or find a more casual opportunity when the two of you are alone. People are more defensive when there is an audience, right? And then the other thing is try to find empathy with them, right? So don't open with, that's really fucked up and I need to tell you why you're so fucked up, right? You may feel that way, right? And in fact, you can say that to someone if your goal is to express your anger as opposed to change their mind. You can't necessarily have both goals all the time. Both goals are valid, but you can't always do them both at the same time. If your goal is to really change somebody, to bring someone along, the thing to do is to try to have empathy with them about why they might have said what they said. Try to afford them the best of intentions, right? It might sound something like that, and I sort of hate scripts, so make this sound however it sounds to you, right? This isn't like, you shouldn't say these actual words unless they sound natural to you, but something like, hey, you probably didn't mean anything by that, but it kind of bugged me, can we talk about it, right? Can I tell you about why it bothers me? Which is not defensive. It's not like you're wrong and I'm right. It's like you're my friend and you care about me, and I want you to know that something that you said is troubling me, even though I know that you probably had the best of intentions with it. And that's really the framework in which you can have those deeper conversations. It's going to be scary, right? Like, I can't tell you that there's a way to do it that feels awesome. And I also will say, it's not your responsibility, it's nobody's responsibility to do it 100% of the time, right? Even I don't call people out on messed up things they say 100% of the time, and this is my job. It's exhausting, right? But pick people you think might listen to you. I saw a great diagram once, and I wish I knew where because I can't credit it. Sort of picture a semicircle, or like the dial on like a gas gauge on a car or something, or the speed gauge. When you're trying to convince people, you're trying to do the work of changing minds. Let's say you're here. Let's just assume everyone in this room, this is a thought experiment, obviously you're not, but let's assume everyone in this room is all the way on this pole, which we're going to assume is like the right and awesome pole, right? I'm oversimplifying on purpose, right? And over here are sort of staunch rapists and rape apologists, right? It's not really useful to argue with these people all the way on the other side from you, unless there's an audience, right? If you know, sometimes what I do is I engage with people over here, not because I think I can change their minds, but because I think lots of other people are listening, and it's useful for them to hear me out, right? So in the comments thread, or on TV, these are places I might argue with somebody over here. But if it's really just a one-on-one situation, if you think of a midpoint here, you want to stay on this side of the dial. The people who are on your side of the dial are the people that you might be able to sort of move slightly closer to your position. And the last thing I'll say about that is, don't expect satisfaction, right? And that's not because you're not having an impact. It's because people hate to change, and they especially hate to like admit that they changed because of you, and they even more hate to admit that they changed their moral view of the world because you said something to them, and therefore they've been running their moral lives wrong up until now. That's a big lift you're asking of somebody. It's a big lift I've asked of some of you tonight. That's probably not going to happen instantly, and even if it does happen instantly, they're not going to tell you, right? They're not going to say, oh my goodness, now I see that I've been living my life wrong, and thanks to you, I'm going to live it right. It happens very rarely. More likely, they're going to go off and think about it, and they're going to argue with you, and they might resist it, and they're going to go off, and maybe they hear this idea in a different way from a different place, and then a third time, and then a fourth time, and maybe the sixth or seventh time, they start to be like, oh, this is like that thing that so-and-so was saying to me, and then they seem really receptive. That time somebody really gets it when you talk to them, it's because they've heard it before, and they just were right to get it, right? And so you have to think about it like planting a seed for a plant that you're not going to see grow to fruition, right? And the answer to that, the ultimate answer is you have to have friends, right? You have to have friends who are also engaging in this, who can support and remind you. Because that's hard. It's hard to keep doing this work and not directly seeing results that you can attest to your actual work. And so the important thing is to have a community so that when you start to feel like, oh God, I had this horrible, difficult conversation, other people are there to remind you of the kind of thing that I just said. Is that helpful? I want to thank you all so much for these marvelous and provocative questions, and for coming tonight and inviting me to your cast. And I also just want to wish you safe sex lives.
I do have to thank you as well, so don't think you've got away without it. Thank you very much for coming to Durham University. Thank you for being so generous with your time. Thank you for answering some incredibly difficult questions and very wide-ranging. I know that there's a lot of people here in this room who speak out about sexual violence, and I know that they're going to take strength from you, hearing you speak out about sexual violence. It's never an easy thing to do. You, to some extent, always put yourself in a place where ultimately some people aren't going to like what you say, and it's a very ultimately brave thing to do. I know that there's going to be people in the audience who are going to take strength from that and continue to develop their own anti-violence work, strengthened by you coming over this evening. Thank you.
Thank you.